Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures, home of the Quarantined Wargamer. I'm Big Lee, and today I want to talk about buying new brushes. So way back when I started doing the Quarantined Wargamer series of films, I did a short film about how I care for my brushes, and at the time I thought to myself I might do a video on buying brushes, but I thought it was perhaps a little bit too much of a minefield because everyone has their own opinions about what makes a really good painting brush. But then last week I bought a few new brushes and I was chatting to my wife about my purchases, and after 10 minutes of me rambling on about buying brushes and how and why I did what I did, she looked at me and just said, "You need to do a video for that," as if to say, go away and bore someone else. So here I am, boring you. But actually, more to the point, I actually think that perhaps there is something in what she's saying, in that there's some things that I've learned over the years that I think might be useful to new painters who perhaps are buying brushes for the first time. It's very easy to end up spending your money on a fancy set from one of the big games companies and finding actually they don't perform always the way you thought they should. Now I've made it quite clear before that I personally have invested in some really expensive Winsor & Newton Series 7s, and I've had a very long service life for my brushes, partly due to the way that I care for them, but partly due to the sheer quality of the brushes. But not everyone can stretch to £15 or £20 a brush, because they can be very expensive. So, and definitely the challenge, the painting challenge, which ended a couple of weeks ago, definitely tested my brushes to the limit. Some of them are definitely past their prime, to say the least. And so, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I decided it was time for me to buy some new brushes. People have different opinions about what makes a really good painting brush, as I mentioned. I love Sable brushes. Other people really quite swear by hair or nylon brushes. And as I say, I'm not an expert, but I think I might have picked up a few things, and I definitely think it's worth sharing some of the things that I've learned for those newbies out there who are thinking about buying a new set of brushes. So before I start and talk about what your brush should be made of, it's worth mentioning that there are different shaped brushes. And the same is true whether you're buying large watercolour brushes or miniatures painting brushes. They tend to come in different shaped heads. And it's worth knowing what they do and what the advantages are so that you can make an informed choice when you're picking your new set of brushes from whatever manufacturer you end up going with. So the standard one is a rounded tip. It's good for applying base colours, controlling washes, and the fuller body of a rounded tip brush holds more liquid than some of the other types. And then there's a slight variation on that. You get pointed rounds, so they tend to have a sharper pointed tip, which are really good for detail painting because the liquid flows down the hairs or whatever the brush is made of to that fine tip, and you can get a very fine point with that with the right control. And then an even bigger variation on that, or a more detailed variation on that, is the detail round. Now these basically tend to be very small rounded tips. They use shorter hairs, and they tend to have a very sharper tip, and the idea is they are there for doing that really fine detail work. So we're talking about the double O's, the treble O's when you're buying brushes. Then there are flat brushes. Now these tend to have a square end, and they're ideal for dry brushing and varnishing, and the larger versions are really good for painting terrain. Basically they're like a normal painter's brush, and you can buy them in all sorts of materials, which I'll come to in a minute, but they are really good for large flat areas of painting. And then there's something called the filibert. Now these are flat oval shapes, and they tend to be really good, particularly the smaller ones, where the hairs are relatively soft, for wet blending. They come in a range of sizes, so everything from the big ones for watercolourists through to the smaller ones that are ideal for mini painters. And then you'll have an angular flat, so it's got like a sharp point to one end, and that's useful for cutting in when you're trying to work inside a limit, a model perhaps with a very defined boundary, or when you're painting up to the edge of a wall or something like that, and you don't want to get the paint on the other surfaces. So they're really good for cutting in and doing those corners and things like that. Now most painters will use a variety of these brushes. I do, from different manufacturers and so on. However, what they're made of is also really important. So the first material we're going to look at is Sable. Now this is a particular material that I swear by. I buy all my best brushes are made in Sable, and it comes in a range of qualities, and you know, it can be expensive. Sable tends to be it's a hair that has ideal brush making qualities. It has natural spring and firmness to it, so it bounces back into its natural shape, and the scales on the surface of the hair actually help it to hold quite a lot of liquid for its volume, and the liquid in itself flows nicely down the length of the hairs. Particularly if you've got a brush with a really good point, you can get a really fine line out of a Sable hair brush. Kolinsky Sable is the best quality, but they do tend to be the most expensive as well. So you can easily pay 12, 15 or more pound for a really good Kolinsky Sable brush. For the larger brushes, you can be looking at 20 quid above. For miniatures brushes, 10, 12 quid is a reasonable price for a good quality Kolinsky Sable brush. If you're going to have a hair brush like a Sable brush, then it's really important to clean them so that you maximise the life of the brush itself. So have a look at my video about cleaning. There's lots of other videos online about how to clean brushes, but definitely buy yourself a good brush soap and make sure you clean those brushes regularly so that you keep those expensive hair brushes going for many years to come. And Sable miniatures brushes, you can get particular Sable brushes that are designed for miniatures painters, and they tend to have shorter hairs so that you've got a little bit more control. But of course the downside is that they hold less liquid, so you need to recharge them if you like, dip them in your paint a little bit more regular, but you do have more control with them. And then you have synthetic brushes, so we're talking about nylon or polyester, and they're made primarily for use with acrylics, although there are synthetic brushes for other mediums. They tend to be very durable, and again the fibres are very flexible, so they're quite long lasting. They can be highly responsive brushes, but they do tend to carry less paint than the equivalent hairbrush. They're useful for dry brushing because they're cheaper, so you can get yourself a good cheap dry brushing brush for £1 or £2, and it doesn't matter if it gets damaged. I certainly wouldn't advise dry brushing with a really good hairbrush, like a Kolinsky Sable brush for instance. What a waste. Polyester brushes tend to have softer bristles, so maybe have slightly less control, particularly if you've got long fibres on them. So if you've got long bristles, they tend to be very soft. It has some uses, but I find it slightly less control when you're trying to paint a miniature. I do find them more difficult to control than the equivalent Sable brush, for instance. But saying that, they do have their value. I do find them really useful doing like block painting and priming because they are cheaper, and it doesn't matter if they get damaged or wear out over time. So they're really good for those sort of stock jobs when you're preparing a miniature or group of miniatures. You can do that priming and then the block painting, and then you get out your really good quality brushes when you get down to the fine detail. Now there are other types of hair brushes, so hog bristles are very common. They're really designed for use with thick oils or some types of thicker acrylic paints. That can be a bit coarse for the sort of work that we're doing, but they are strong and long lasting, and they're really good when you want to do thick applications of colour. So when you're painting terrain or rough textured surfaces, a good quality hog painting brush is as good as any other for doing that sort of base coating on large objects like terrain and so on. However, it has to be said that all natural hairs can be damaged by acrylic paint over time, so as always, don't leave them sitting in water, and make sure you clean them properly and you dry them out properly before you store them, because you don't want them to go mouldy. Now another part of the brush that often gets overlooked by painters is the handles themselves. Now these can be made of wood or plastic or even bamboo. Now most artists' paintbrushes tend to have wooden handles, and the really good quality ones tend to be beech because it soaks up less liquid, They tend to be lacquered handles. Most, the best quality ones will have a proper lacquered handle, because again, it makes them waterproof and they don't soak up water. But then I would never advise that you leave a brush standing in water anyway, because what you don't want is water getting underneath the ferrule and dissolving or damaging the glue that holds the fibres in place. Now, another part of the handle is the shape. There are miniatures painters tend to have, or ranges that include brushes designed for miniatures painters tend to have shorter handles. They're slightly easier to control when you're painting really tiny objects. Some ranges have triangular handles, which are supposedly really good for gripping. I've never bought or used those, so I can't really comment, but I don't have any problems holding a regular round brush. The only thing I would say is that the stockiness of the handle can make a bit of a difference. So cheaper brushes tend to have thinner handles, whereas well, the Winsor & Newtons, for instance, that I buy, the beech handle is slightly thicker, so it just makes it more comfortable to hold in your hand. But like I say, I've never found a need for such precision. I need a specially shaped handle. It depends really what you're used to. I've never used triangular handle brushes, so it's hard for me to comment. If that's what you've used before and you're comfortable with them, fine. Now, there are lots of brush manufacturers out there. Some of them make brushes specifically designed for miniatures painters, but I'm not going to make any recommendations. That's a bit of a minefield, because people tend to get very jealously guard their favourite manufacturers, and I'm no different. So I'm not really going to make any particular recommendations for particular ranges. But what I would advise you to do is find yourself a good art supplier. Now, that's probably a local shop or even an online supplier, but the point is they will often sell several ranges, enabling you to compare prices, and they often all have really good information on how to select brushes. And if you can actually visit an actual art shop, they can talk to you about what's the best brush for your needs. And they don't tend to look down on miniatures painters because we're painting toy soldiers. They're selling an art brush to an artist, and that's all that they're interested in. But as I've mentioned several times, whatever you're doing, buy the best brush that you can afford and care for it properly to maximise the life of that particular brush. They are, after all, probably the most important tool that is going to touch your miniature. So you want to make sure that you're getting the right one for you, that's going to last a long time and give you the finish that you want on your figures. So, as I've mentioned, look at my video on brush care and look online for advice and so on. And if you can get a local store that can help you, even better. So, they're my suggestions and a bit of advice. What do you think? Have you got any preferences, suggestions, any snippets of insider knowledge that you think I might have missed out there that you think is worth sharing with any newbies to the hobby that maybe are watching this video? So as always, I'd say please leave some comments and have a bit of a discussion in the comments below. So as always, I'd say if you found that interesting, please like, subscribe and share. So until next week, as always, keep safe. Get as many games in as you can, and of course, keep rolling high.